They had dressed Cassia Winkham for admiration and left Lisara for usefulness. On the afternoon the Duke of Thornwood came to Winkham Hall, Cassia stood before the cloudy mirror in the green withdrawing room while a maid pinned pearl-tipped combs into her pale gold hair. Their mother fussed over the fall of muslin at her shoulders and the line of the blue ribbon at her waist, as though the right arrangement of silk might persuade fortune to forget how far the house had fallen. The late spring light lying across the room had a tired look to it. It showed the thinning carpet at the threshold, the silvering at the edges of the glass, the crack in the plaster above the mantel that no one mentioned when callers were expected. Lisara stood 2 doors away in the morning room with her sleeves pinned back, checking the week's accounts beside an open window that smelled faintly of rain and wet earth. The ledgers had to be made to agree before supper. 3 sacks of flour had been charged twice. The poultry boy's mother had sent word that he would leave service if his wages were delayed again. One of the south chimneys needed repairing before another storm worked more water through the brick. There was a list for the dairy, a list for the cellar, and another for the kitchen maid whose sister had taken fever. Lisara held the household together the way some women held lace, patiently, invisibly, with hands no one admired unless the thing began to tear. Her father had once been Baron Winkham, in the lazy style local society still used for old landed families with more history than coin. The title had no real legal force in Virginia, but the habit of rank clung to him long after substance had fled. A speculative venture in tobacco shipping had broken him 6 years earlier. 2 bad seasons had finished what debt began. Since then, Winkham Hall had continued on in the dangerous half-life of houses too proud to shrink and too poor to stand upright without fraud, delay, and the labor of one daughter whose usefulness had become so constant it was mistaken for nature. Cassia had been spared the knowledge of most of it. At 19, she still moved through rooms as though they existed to catch her reflection kindly. She was not cruel by design. She had simply been loved in the easy, expensive way that leaves a girl certain someone else will settle the bill. Lisara, 4 years older, had been entrusted with uglier truths. She knew which tenant was likely to leave at Michaelmas, which lender had grown impatient, which pieces of silver had already been sold and replaced with plated imitations for formal dinners. She knew the cook watered the cream when guests were expected, and that their mother called it prudent management instead of desperation. When the first carriage wheels sounded in the drive, their mother called sharply for Lisara, not because she was wanted in the room, but because there were a dozen last tasks to be done before she vanished from sight. See that the blue porcelain is laid, not the white. The Duke's mother was said to favor blue in Annapolis, and such families notice everything. And tell Mr. Dobbins to keep his coat closed. The brass buttons are not all original. Yes, Mama. And do not stand in the front hall when he enters. It confuses the impression. Lisara lowered her eyes, not from obedience alone, but because she had learned long ago that a mild face saved time. No, Mama. Their mother turned away before the words were done. All her feeling gathered toward Cassia and the better future that still might be bought if one secured the right husband in time. By the time Adrien Vale, Duke of Thornwood, crossed the threshold, Lisara was in the passage beyond the dining parlor, directing a footman to bring the least damaged decanters and asking the kitchen for 6 extra minutes on the capon so the cracked glaze on one platter could be turned discreetly toward the wall. She heard the sounds of greeting before she saw him, her father's softened laugh, her mother's bright, false warmth. Cassia's voice pitched 1 note higher than sincerity. It was enough to sketch the scene without witnessing it. She did not intend to look. Yet, when she passed the front hall with a tray of folded napkins, she caught a single, clear impression. He was taller than she had expected, not imposing in the blunt way of men who mistake size for authority, but spare and self-contained, with a grave carriage that made other people seem untidy around him. His coat was dark bottle green, cut with severe restraint. Rain darkened the shoulders from recent travel. He stood with one gloved hand resting lightly on the head of his cane, while their father spoke too expansively about the road conditions and the hunting on neighboring land. The Duke listened with the expression of a man long practiced in hearing more than was said. Cassia laughed. Their mother leaned in. Adrien inclined his head with perfect courtesy. Then, for one brief and impossible moment, his eyes shifted beyond them all and met Lisara's, where she stood half-concealed in the corridor. It was not admiration, not curiosity either. It was recognition of a different order, swift, measured, unsettling. He looked at the tray in her hands, at the ink smudge near her cuff, at the household keys at her belt that no guest should have noticed beneath plain gray-blue wool. His gaze returned to her face, as though correcting an earlier omission in the room itself. Lisara moved on at once. All afternoon she told herself it had meant nothing. By supper, it had already begun to mean too much. If this story of the women men overlook, the bargains old houses make, and the price of finally being seen draws you in, like the video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America, where dignity is never as powerless as it appears. They dined in the long room overlooking the west lawn, with candles placed strategically to flatter the portraits and leave the worn places in shadow. Their mother had seated Cassia at the Duke's right hand. Lisara had expected to remain absent except when needed, but halfway through the second course, the under-butler discovered that one of the serving boys had sliced his palm on broken crystal in the pantry, and Lisara took his place without ceremony because the food still had to move, and the guests still had to be made comfortable. Whatever blood had stained the cloth below stairs. She entered with a dish of stewed asparagus and felt at once the delicate cruelty of the table's arrangement. Cassia was radiant in pale rose silk. Their mother smiled too often. Their father drank with the effort of a man performing solvency. Adrien sat almost motionless amid the performance, asking few questions, offering fewer easy compliments, and missing nothing. The Zara served in silence. That, too, had long ago become a kind of language. My elder daughter has always preferred usefulness to admiration, their mother said lightly when Adrien remarked upon the precision of the household service. A blessing, in its way. Every family must have one steady creature to keep the lamps trimmed while prettier things are admired. The table answered with obedient laughter. Cassia's came a shade late, then vanished when she saw Lisara's face remain composed. Lisara set down the dish beside Colonel Marrow and turned away. But their mother, encouraged by the Duke's attention, mistook silence for safety. She has the soul of a steward, I think. Had Providence made her a son, she might have spared my husband half his anxieties. As it is, she is a comfort of the domestic sort. Their father's mouth tightened, though whether at the truth or its public telling, Lisara could not say. She expected the Duke to let the moment pass. Most men of rank did. Public humiliations of women without consequence were among the cheapest entertainments in any room. Instead, Adrien lifted his wine glass, looked not at their mother, but at Lisara, and said in an even voice, "Then the house owes more to Miss Winkham than it has had the honesty to confess." Nothing dramatic followed. No one dropped a fork, no servant gasped. Yet the air changed so decisively that Lisara felt it along her skin. Their mother gave a strained little smile. "You are generous, Your Grace." "No," he said, "only observant." It should have ended there, but Cassia, flushed by the need to recover her place, said with a girlish laugh, "Lisara does manage everything. If we all vanished tomorrow, she would still know where the plum preserves were kept and which tenants meant to cheat Papa on the wool tally." More laughter. Less cruel this time, but still at her expense, still based on the same comfortable assumption that Lisara's competence was mildly comic. Because it was not beauty. Adrien set down his glass. A rare accomplishment, he said, his gaze resting calmly on Cassia until the color in her cheeks changed meaning. Beauty is often praised for occupying a room. Far fewer people are capable of keeping one from collapse. The silence that followed was polished and absolute. Lisara stood with the serving spoon in her hand, feeling the blood beat once hard at her throat. No one had spoken for her like that before. Not because she had lacked merit, but because those nearest her had found it cheaper never to name it. Adrien turned slightly toward her. Miss Winkham, would you be so good as to advise whether the north road to Thornwood still floods after heavy rain? I was told no one in this district knows the local estate routes better than you. It was an impossible kindness, because it gave her neither pity nor ornament. It gave her authority. She answered carefully. The road through Havers Field is firmer after April, Your Grace, but the lower crossing near the mill still takes water when the river swells. If you travel south tomorrow, I would avoid it before noon. Then I am obliged to you. Their mother never forgave the steadiness of Lisara's reply. Lisara saw it in the small, hard glitter that settled in her eyes. After supper, while the ladies withdrew and the gentlemen remained for port, Lisara escaped to the back gallery with a tray of empty glasses and stood for a moment beside the open door that led on to the terrace. Evening had deepened over the lawns. The yew hedges looked nearly black. Somewhere, in the dark, a stable lantern moved like a low, thoughtful star. You did not deserve that, said a voice behind her. She turned too quickly. Adrien had come from the dining room without noise. He stood just inside the threshold, one hand bare now, gloves folded in the other. I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not know. No. You seldom are told what is about to occur, I think. That seems one of the house's habits. His tone was not intimate. If anything, it was cooler than tenderness. But it held something more dangerous. Respect, sharpened by anger on her behalf. Lisara drew herself straighter. My mother meant no harm. One dark brow shifted very slightly. Then I fear she has practiced harm so long she no longer knows it by touch. The words were too near the truth. Lisara looked out toward the lawn because the steadiness of his attention was more difficult to bear than mockery. You are kind to say what you did, sir. I was not being kind. He paused. I was correcting a false account presented in my hearing. She almost smiled then, though she kept it from her mouth. You speak as though households may be balanced like ledgers. The honest ones can. He glanced at the tray. You run this place. I assist in it. You save it daily, which is a larger office. No one had ever said save before. Keep, manage, tend, patch, carry, yes. Never save. Lisara felt the dangerous pull of wanting to be understood by him. It was a want that could only injure her if indulged. So she said, with the measured tone she used when closing doors on her own heart, Winkham Hall has survived many indignities, Your Grace. It will survive being accurately named. Something in his face altered, not softened, but deepened. And you, Miss Winkham? She met his eyes then because retreat had become impossible. I have had the same training. He looked at her for a moment longer than propriety allowed. Then he bowed and let her go. The next morning brought ruin of a smaller but more practical kind. 2 creditors arrived before breakfast. One demanded payment on a note their father had promised to settle weeks earlier. The other wanted immediate assurance concerning grain purchased on expected harvest yields that had not materialized. Lisara intercepted both in the outer office before they reached the breakfast room where her mother and Cassia were still arranging their expressions, for another day of genteel hope. She promised partial payment by Friday, a meeting with her father at noon, and security on the summer wool contracts if patience prevailed. She spoke with such order that the men left only half suspicious. When she turned from them, Adrien was standing in the passage near the library door. He had heard enough. Humiliation took hold, low and hot beneath her ribs. This, more than last night's mockery, was what she could not bear. That the Duke should see not merely her diminished place, but the machinery of need beneath it. "You should not have been troubled with household business," she said. "On the contrary," he replied, "I have been trying since yesterday to understand how this house still stands. Now I begin to know. It stands badly. It stands because you do not permit it to fall." The library door stood open behind him, showing shelves half-filled where books had been sold in discrete stages over the years. Morning light lay across the worn turkey carpet in long, pale bars. Adrien stepped aside and said, almost as if asking her opinion on weather, "Will you walk with me?" No woman in Lisara's position refused such a request without cause. No prudent woman accepted without caution. She chose caution and followed him onto the terrace, where the clipped box hedges concealed them from the breakfast windows. "I am told," he said, "that my mother has already begun to imagine a wedding at Thornwood, though I have not offered for anyone." Lisara kept her hands folded to hide their tension. Mothers with sons and houses often like to imagine aloud. Mine does it in writing, which is less noisy and more relentless. A trace of dry humor touched his mouth and vanished. "She has settled upon the necessity of my remarriage." The word remarriage explained several things at once: the reserve in him, the watchfulness, the shadow that never seemed to lift fully even when he was polite. Lisara had heard, in fragments, that his young wife had died 3 years earlier after a winter fever in Annapolis. Society had given the tragedy the respectful polish it gives all well-bred grief, then moved on to speculate about his next alliance. "I am sorry," she said quietly. He inclined his head once, receiving the words without display. "I have no wish to marry for management," he said, "still less for strategy devised by other hands. Yet strategy is sometimes the cleanest defense against intrusion." The warning came to her a heartbeat before the meaning. She stopped walking. "Your Grace, I am going to say something unusual, Miss Winkham. I would prefer you let me finish before deciding whether to be offended." Against her will, curiosity steadied her. "Very well. Come to Thornwood for 6 weeks as my guest, publicly, properly, under the protection of my aunt and grandmother, and under the understood appearance of a serious courtship." He spoke with the same calm he might have used to discuss estate boundaries. "It would silence my mother's more aggressive ambitions, interrupt several unwelcome negotiations already underway, and allow me to honor what I observed here, that you deserve a sphere larger than this house permits you." Lisara stared at him. The clipped hedges, the gravel path, the sparrows in the espalier pear tree, all seemed to recede from ordinary meaning. "You ask me to pretend. I ask you to enter an arrangement that protects us both." He held her gaze. "You would be treated with open respect. You would have no obligations to me beyond honesty. If at the end of 6 weeks we choose to part, we part. If my mother's pressure is broken, the purpose is served. Meanwhile, your family receives the reflected security of my public regard, which may quiet certain creditors without direct insult to your pride." There it was, the part she hated precisely because it was useful. "And if your mother chooses to hate me instead?" "She will have to do so in the presence of people she cannot afford to shock." "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It is a guarantee of terrain, not of comfort. I cannot promise comfort. Only truth, form, and my name used in your defense whenever needed." Lisara looked away across the damp lawns of the house she had spent 6 years rescuing from disgrace by inches. An arrangement like this was madness. Worse, it was temptation. She could already hear what local society would say, that the practical daughter had cast a net where the pretty one failed. That distress had sharpened her ambition, that the Duke amused himself with competence because beauty bored him. None of it would spare Cassia's feelings either. And yet, beneath all fear, there moved another truth, quiet and devastating. For 6 weeks, she might live in a world where her mind was not treated as a household utility. For 6 weeks, she might discover whether being seen changed a woman's shape from within. "Why me?" she asked at last. He did not answer at once. "Because when a roof threatens to fail," he said finally, "most people admire the chandelier and pray. You go for the beam. I have lived too long among those who confuse decoration for character." The sincerity of it struck deeper than flattery would have done. "And because," he added more quietly, "when your mother insulted you, you neither pleaded nor performed injury. You endured it, judged it, and went on. I would like, once in my life, to keep company with someone whose strength is not arranged for spectators." Lisara's breath caught. No one had ever desired her company in those terms. She should have refused immediately. She did not. That failure, or courage, altered everything that followed. Cassia wept when the plan was proposed in softened language over tea. Their mother turned white, then red, then white again, as Adrien, with merciless courtesy, made it clear that his invitation was extended to Miss Lisara Winkham specifically, with chaperonage assured and every propriety observed. Their father tried to convert astonishment into pride and nearly managed it. The servants heard within the hour. By evening, the nearest neighbors would know. By morning, all the county. Cassia's pain was the only part that cut Lisara cleanly. "He was meant to admire me," she said later in the shared bedchamber of their girlhood, where the curtains still smelled faintly of lavender and old summers. Why would he not? Lisara, who had no language for such wounds that did not worsen them, answered with painful honesty. "Because admiration is not always the thing a man seeks first." Cassia looked at her through tears. "Then what is?" Lisara thought of the Duke's face when he noticed an ink mark at her cuff, the keys at her waist, the structure beneath collapse. "Relief," she said. Cassia did not understand, and perhaps Lisara herself only half did. Yet the word remained. 3 days later, she rode away from Winkham Hall in Adrien's traveling carriage with her trunk, 2 serviceable gowns, 1 better dressed, turned and mended for evening use, and a mind full of warnings. The road to Thornwood passed through fields bright with young wheat and along stretches of river road where marshlight lay silver on the reeds. Adrien rode part of the way beside the carriage, preferring his horse in fair weather. When he joined her at midday, he spoke not of feeling, but of practicalities. His grandmother, Lady Seraphine Vale, who governed the old house with intelligence severe enough to frighten politicians. His aunt, Mrs. Berwick, a widow with excellent manners and better sense. The neighboring families, likely to call. The forms by which their arrangement would be understood. His precision soothed her more than gallantry might have done. At Thornwood, the world widened and tightened at once. The house itself stood on high ground above the York River, red brick and white trim, with broad steps, long windows, and formal gardens laid out with mathematical calm. Nothing in it spoke of panic disguised as elegance. The servants moved with the discipline of a household funded not by hope, but by means. Lisara felt the difference in her body before she named it. At Winkham Hall, every decision had been triage. At Thornwood, order existed before crisis. It was the first luxury she had ever envied. Lady Seraphine received her in a blue drawing room that looked west over clipped lawns and the line of cedars darkening toward the river. She was small, erect, and silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to weigh not appearance, but tensile strength. "So you are the daughter who keeps a ruined house from admitting it is ruined," she said after the first formalities. Lisara, too startled to feign modest idiocy, answered, "I have done what was necessary, ma'am." Necessary is usually the first honest word in any room. The older woman's gaze sharpened. "And do you understand what my grandson is doing?" "In part." "Then understand the rest. Society forgives men almost anything if they appear bored enough while doing it. It forgives women nothing, unless those women teach society how it will be required to speak of them. If you remain here, Miss Winkham, you must never behave as though you have arrived by accident." It was not welcome. It was instruction. Lisara valued it more. Adrien watched from beside the mantel with a stillness that suggested he had expected no gentler opening. "I will remember," she said. "Good." Lady Seraphine rang for tea. "Then we may proceed." The first week at Thornwood was less romantic than strategic, and therefore more dangerous. Lisara learned the household rhythms, the arrangement of visits, the factions among neighboring ladies, the particular malice of women who preferred a bride beautiful enough to praise and hollow enough to place. She discovered that Adrien's mother, Lady Eleanor Vale, was not permanently in residence, but hovered around Annapolis and Williamsburg like a storm front seeking profitable landfall. Letters arrived from her every second day. Adrien read them without visible emotion and placed them unread to Lisara in a lacquer box after the first two. "If our arrangement is to hold," he said, "you should know the shape of the opposition." The letters were masterpieces of polished coercion. Lady Eleanor wrote of duty, alliances, the need for a duchess equal to Thornwood's expectations, the impropriety of elevating a woman whose family could not answer inquiries without embarrassment. She never insulted Lisara directly. She preferred the finer cruelty of classification. "She writes as if people were parcels to be sorted by destination," Lisara said. Adrien, leaning one shoulder against the library shelves, gave a short, grim breath that was nearly a laugh. That is one of her kinder habits. Their companionship settled into an intimacy built not on declarations, but on use. He brought her estate maps when she asked how the outer farms were accounted for. She discovered an inefficiency in the tenant ledgers that had been quietly bleeding the western parcels for 2 seasons. He listened. She spoke more than she had meant to. Some evenings they rode out beyond the orchard and talked of everything except the loss sitting between them like an invisible third rider. Other evenings they said very little, and the silence was not empty. Then society arrived to test the fiction and found, to its dissatisfaction, that it was becoming less fictional by the day. At a musicale in Williamsburg, Lisara wore the dove-gray silk Thornwood's seamstress had revived from an old gown of Lady Seraphine's, recut with elegant restraint. She had never looked so carefully composed in her life. That alone irritated half the room. The other half waited to see whether she would betray low breeding by reaching, staring, or speaking too much. Cassia would once have danced through such an evening like light on glass. Lisara moved through it with the discipline of a woman who had balanced trays while being ignored. Every lesson in invisibility now became a kind of armor. She knew how to stand without pleading for notice. She knew how to hear insult before it reached her face. She knew how to remain still while other people exhausted themselves performing superiority. "The Duke's experiment wears plain colors well," murmured Mrs. Armitage to a companion near the pianoforte, not quite softly enough. Another lady replied, "Men grieving a first wife often mistake sobriety for depth. It usually passes by autumn." Lisara kept her gaze on the page of music in her hand, though she was not reading it. Adrien, who had been speaking with a naval captain near the far arch, crossed the room with an ease so measured it silenced speculation by the force of its intention. He did not challenge the women. He did something far worse. He addressed Lisara before them all about the improvements she had suggested to the York tenant structure, then asked whether she agreed with his steward's figures on a river transport levy. It was not a gallant rescue. It was public confirmation that her judgment entered the sphere of male consequence. The two ladies were left smiling with frozen mouths, while Lisara answered in a calm voice that concealed the quake in her pulse. Afterward, as they stood near a tall window where the night pressed black against the panes, she said without looking at him, "You make enemies for me very elegantly. Would you prefer I did it clumsily?" "I would prefer not to need defending." His expression altered. "So would I. But until the world improves, I choose accuracy over convenience." She turned then. The candlelight showed the old fatigue beneath his composure. "You speak as if improvement were possible." "It is, in limited districts, under pressure." He held her eyes. "I have become interested in applying some." It was then, perhaps, that she first understood the extent of his loneliness. Not the loneliness of lacking company, but of living among people who found truth less useful than arrangement. Yet Thornwood was not an idol devised to flatter Lisara into love. Adrien carried grief like a sealed wound that obeyed him by day and ruled him some nights despite it. Once, passing the long gallery after midnight because she could not sleep, Lisara saw light beneath the library door. Through the slight opening, she glimpsed him seated alone at the desk, with a miniature portrait open in his hand and a decanter untouched beside him. He was not weeping. The stillness in him was worse than that. It was the posture of a man enduring memory as one endures winter water, without sound, without witness, because sound would change nothing. She withdrew before he could see her, ashamed of the tenderness that rose in her like pain. The next morning he spoke with such measured courtesy at breakfast that she knew he had recognized her retreating footstep. Neither mentioned it. But something new and fragile existed between them from that hour onward. The knowledge that each had seen the other's private discipline and not exploited it. Lady Eleanor arrived in person at the start of the third week. She came with 2 trunks, a maid whose face suggested permanent injury by other people's incompetence, and the expression of a woman prepared to recatalogue an entire household to correct one intolerable deviation. Beautiful once and still formidable, she possessed the polished hardness of silver too often handled. She embraced Adrien, kissed Lady Seraphine's cheek with filial exactness, and turned to Lisara with a smile of such faultless breeding that lesser women might have mistaken it for welcome. "Miss Winkham, my son writes of your steadiness with uncommon frequency. I had not realized practicality could be made so socially visible." "Your ladyship is kind to notice me," Lisara replied. Lady Eleanor's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. She had expected either gratitude or defensiveness, and received neither. The days that followed were a campaign fought with teaspoons, invitations, pauses, and seating charts. Lady Eleanor praised Cassia in absentia. She lamented the rashness of modern men who chose feeling over fitness. She arranged a dinner featuring the daughter of a Maryland judge reputed to be beautiful, rich, and spectacularly obedient. She spoke of Adrien's first wife, Genevieve, with a sanctity so polished that it became a weapon. She never said Lisara was unworthy. She preferred to speak as though worthiness were beside the point and lineage the only durable fact. At first, Lisara endured it with old habits, but endurance alone had begun to feel too much like the life she was outgrowing. The change came over something seemingly small. Lady Eleanor had invited 8 guests for supper, among them a bishop's widow and Mr. Pembroke, a widower with sound land and a cultivated air of moral discretion. Lisara understood before the soup course that Lady Eleanor intended to place her in comparison with every sort of woman considered proper and with at least one man who might have been deemed appropriate if one wished to dispose quietly of a troublesome dependent. Midway through the fish, Mr. Pembroke remarked with bland concern that managing a small household taught a woman excellent habits for usefulness, even where brilliance was unnecessary. There had been a time when Lisara would have smiled faintly and let the insult slide over her like dirty water she had long ago accepted as weather. Instead, she laid down her fork and said, in the calm tone of someone correcting a column of figures, "That depends, sir, upon whether the household values usefulness more than display. In my experience, the houses that survive hardship longest are usually governed by the women whom society has the least imagination to praise." No one moved. Lady Eleanor's eyes flashed. Mr. Pembroke laughed uncertainly. Lady Seraphine, at the far end of the table, lifted her glass to her mouth and hid the corner of a smile. Adrien said only, "Precisely." The moment was small by public standards. To Lisara, it felt like stepping for the first time onto ground that did not give way beneath her. Later that night, Adrien found her in the orangery, where the air smelled of damp leaves and bitter blossom. "You have changed," he said. "Have I? 3 weeks ago, you would have let him speak and called it peace." She touched the stone ledge beside a potted lemon tree, feeling the night's coolness gathered in it. "3 weeks ago, I thought silence always cost less." "And now?" She looked at him. "Now I think it merely sends the bill elsewhere." That was when he laughed, truly laughed, low and surprised, as if some locked chamber in him had opened of its own accord. The sound altered the room. It altered her. What followed between them did not rush into confession. That would have been easy, and nothing true between them had yet chosen the easy course. Instead, affection deepened through acts so restrained that only the two involved could fully measure them. He trusted her with the Western rent dispute and accepted her judgment over that of 2 men older than she. She sat with Lady Seraphine through an attack of the old woman's chest weakness and earned, by dawn, a quiet allegiance stronger than any spoken endorsement. He showed her the unfinished chapel walk where Genevieve had once planned rose trellises, and for the first time spoke of his wife not as a sanctified absence, but as a person whose dying had made him distrust joy for surviving her. Lisara listened without trying to rescue him from grief. That, perhaps, was why he continued. "Everyone wishes the dead simplified," he said, as they walked beneath budding lindens. "It saves the living from complexity." "And were you simple with her?" He looked ahead. "No. We were kind. We were young. We were also mistaken about several things, and too proud to admit it before fever ended the argument. The world transformed that into perfection, because perfection makes a prettier monument." Lisara let the truth settle between them without adornment. "Monuments are for stone," she said after a while, "not marriages." He turned his head toward her, and in his face she saw the shock of being met without pretense at the deepest point of his guardedness. When he took her hand that evening in the long gallery, it felt less like conquest than recognition, finally admitting its own name. Their understanding might still have remained private longer had society not chosen violence in silk. At Lady Danbury's midsummer assembly, the rooms blazed with candlelight, gilt mirrors, flowers banked along the stair, and that particular merriment wealthy people create when they hope to witness disgrace before dessert. Lisara entered on Adrien's arm in pale silver gray, her hair dressed simply with seed pearls Lady Seraphine herself had lent her. She was not the prettiest woman present. She was, for the first time in her life, entirely aware that prettiness had become irrelevant. The attack began in whispers and reached open form within the hour. A woman from Annapolis, sharp-faced and eager to please Lady Eleanor, asked within Lisara's hearing whether it was true the Winkham estate had once dismissed servants without wages. Another wondered whether one could call a connection respectable if creditors still hovered near the gate. Then, near the musicians, someone laughed that Thornwood had mistaken a housekeeper for a duchess because grief had made him sentimental. The words were not new. Their public arrangement was. Lisara stood very still. She felt the old instinct rise, to survive by becoming less visible than the insult. But invisibility had become impossible now, not only because Adrien watched, but because she did. Lady Eleanor, resplendent in dark blue silk, did not join the attack. She merely failed to stop it. That failure made her the architect of everything that followed. Adrien crossed the floor. The movement itself parted the room. He did not ask who had spoken first. He did not soothe. He took Lisara's hand, turned with her to face the nearest cluster of listeners, and said in a voice pitched not loudly but perfectly for hearing, "Since so much of this evening has been spent discussing Miss Winkham's place, let us save everyone the labor of guessing. She is here by my invitation, under my honor, and with more fitness for this house than many who presume to judge her. Any insult offered to her will be understood as offered to me." The musicians stopped. No thunder struck, no glass shattered. Yet the silence had the force of a verdict. Then, Lisara did what no one in the room expected. She stepped half a pace forward so that she, not merely Adrien, occupied the center of the wound. "And if my family has known hardship," she said, her voice steady enough to astonish even herself, "that hardship taught me accounts, restraint, labor, and the difference between dignity and display. I recommend the education. It is severe, but very clarifying." Somewhere behind Lady Eleanor, a man choked on his wine. Lady Seraphine closed her fan with a snap that sounded almost like approval. Adrien's fingers tightened once around Lisara's hand, not to guide her, but because he understood the cost of what she had done. That was the moment the arrangement ceased to be defensible as strategy alone. 3 nights later, in the blue drawing room after the last callers had gone, Adrien told her so. Rain moved softly against the long windows. A single lamp burned on the escritoire. Lisara stood by the hearth with one hand resting on the mantel, watching the fire sink into red layers. "I asked you here for 6 weeks," he said. "That was the truth as I understood it then." She turned. "And now?" He came no closer than propriety permitted if one intended to keep speaking clearly. "Now I know. I measure the day by whether I will find you in it. I know this house has become inhabitable to me in a way it was not before your arrival. I know grief has not ended where I thought it would, but altered into something that no longer forbids the future. And I know that if you leave Thornwood at the end of our agreed time, I will have defended myself from my mother, only to surrender everything that makes defense worth the trouble." Lisara's heart moved so hard it seemed to blur the edge of the room. "Adrien." It was the first time she had spoken his Christian name aloud. His expression changed with it, almost imperceptibly. "I cannot offer you innocence," he said. "I have lived too long, varied too much, and mistrusted too often. But I can offer you truth, partnership, my full respect, and a home where your mind will never again be treated as a hidden servant. If you can endure the battle, my name will still draw around you. I would ask you to be my wife. Not for arrangement, not for appearance, for life." All the old injuries in her rose at once. The years of being necessary and unloved, useful and unseen. The humiliations endured because there had been flour to tally, and candles to stretch, and wages to promise. She had imagined such a declaration once or twice in childish secret and always given it to someone prettier, easier, more wanted. "Do not ask from gratitude," she whispered. "I would despise myself if I did. Nor from rebellion against your mother." A flicker of something almost harsh crossed his mouth. "My rebellions are usually less expensive." Despite herself, she laughed, a breath, shaken and bright. Then her face changed, and the truth at her deepest place came forward, unclothed. "If I say yes," she said, "I cannot be useful only. I cannot spend the rest of my life entering rooms as if apologizing for being there. I have begun to unlearn that, and I do not think I could survive learning it again." Adrien looked at her with the grave attention that had first undone her in the corridor at Winkham Hall. "Then do not," he said. "Come as yourself, and let the rest be corrected." She gave him her hand. "Yes." The word felt less like surrender than arrival. Lady Eleanor received the news with a composure so absolute it bordered on miraculous. She sent 3 letters before breakfast. She visited an influential cousin in Williamsburg. She hinted that her son's grief had impaired his judgment. She revived, through careful channels, an old story concerning Lisara's father's debts and a tenant dispute ugly enough to stain any alliance that touched it. She forgot only one thing. Lisara had spent years learning how disorder moved through a house. Once seen, it could be traced. When word reached Thornwood that a packet of copied accounts and suggestive commentary had been quietly placed with 2 neighboring families, Lisara did not collapse. She asked for paper. With Lady Seraphine's support and Adrien's absolute trust, she assembled the true record: dates, settlements, sale inventories, tenancy adjustments, and the sequence of losses that had reduced Winkham Hall without resort to criminal deceit. She included no plea. She merely arranged facts so completely that insinuation had nowhere comfortable left to sit. "This will make enemies," Adrien said as he watched her sand the final page. "I already possess those," she replied. "What I have lacked is a proper filing system." He laughed under his breath, pride and tenderness crossing briefly in his eyes. The confrontation with Lady Eleanor took place not in private, as she would have preferred, but at a luncheon where 12 people sat down expecting asparagus, salmon, and gossip, and received a family reckoning instead. Lisara had asked for this. That fact mattered. When Lady Eleanor, in the smooth language of regret, suggested that unfortunate histories sometimes required delicate silence for the sake of major houses, Lisara set down her napkin and said, "Silence is useful only when all parties bear its cost equally. In my experience, that is seldom the arrangement preferred by the powerful."
Every eye lifted.
She continued before fear could reclaim her. "You have permitted and perhaps encouraged certain accounts of my family that imply fraud where there was failure and disgrace where there was debt. I do not ask your affection, my lady, but I require accuracy if I am to enter your house. I have brought the ledgers." Mrs. Barrack stopped breathing visibly. One guest stared at his plate as though salmon might offer escape. Lady Seraphine's expression became so still it almost looked benevolent. The footman, acting on instructions he did not understand but was wise enough to obey, placed the tied packet of documents beside Lisara's hand. Lady Eleanor looked at her son, expecting intervention. None came. Adrien sat with one hand on the arm of his chair, every inch the immovable ally, but only ally. The field was Lisara's. She opened the packet and, with a clarity born of years spent serving truths no one wanted, walked the table through the history of Winkham Hall's losses. Shipping speculation, failed harvest, sale of plate, reduction of staff, deferred repairs, No stolen wages, no hidden criminality, no debauchery disguised as misfortune. Only pride, miscalculation, and the labor of holding ruin back from the threshold. If hardship disqualifies a woman from respect, she said at last, meeting Lady Eleanor's gaze directly, then society should be more careful where it seeks wives for its sons, because half the houses in this colony survive on courage people are too proud to name. No one spoke. Lady Eleanor's face remained beautiful and nearly expressionless. That near was the victory. At length she said, "You have a forceful manner for one so quiet." "Only when required," Lisara answered. It was Lady Seraphine who ended it. "Then let it be settled," she said, lifting her cup. "Thornwood has suffered enough from pretty evasions. I prefer women who can read a ledger and a room." The guests laughed then, not cruelly, but with the relieved intensity of people witnessing permission change sides. Lady Eleanor never apologized. Women like her rarely do in the forms ordinary people recognize. But she ceased her campaign. More importantly, she altered her language. It began with small things. Miss Winkham became Miss Lisara. Then, my sons intended. Then, one cool October morning when invitations were being discussed in the morning room, she asked whether Lisara preferred white roses or the deeper autumn cream for the chapel arrangements. It was not surrender. It was admission. Cassia came to Thornwood a month before the wedding. Lisara had dreaded the meeting more than she had dreaded society. Yet when her sister descended from the carriage in plum traveling wool and looked up at the house with mingled envy and amazement, what Lisara felt first was tenderness for the girl who had been raised for admiration and found herself unequipped when admiration failed to secure anything true. They walked together that evening along the cedar path above the river, while the last light burned copper behind the water. "I was angry with you," Cassia confessed. "Not because you took something meant for me exactly, more because you survived wanting none of the things I was taught to think mattered, and then somehow received them besides." Lisara smiled sadly. "I wanted them. I simply thought wanting was useless." Cassia was quiet for a long while. "Is he kind?" Lisara thought of Adrien listening without flinching, arguing with precision, grieving honestly, making space rather than asking her to shrink. "Yes," she said, "but not in the soft way people mean when they say it cheaply. He is kind in the way that costs a person something." Cassia nodded as though this, at last, was a language she might begin to learn. They were not reconciled into childish ease. Something better and harder took its place. Truth without ornament. The wedding was held in late October in Thornwood's small chapel overlooking the river. The morning opened clear after 2 days of rain. The brick paths still held damp in their seams. Lisara wore cream silk cut with the same elegant restraint that had gradually become her own, instead of borrowed from others' expectations. Lady Seraphine fastened a string of old pearls at her throat and said, without sentimentality, "Do not lower your eyes unless you wish to. Submission is not the same thing as grace." Lisara laughed, then nearly cried, then did neither because the day felt too exact for waste. When she entered the chapel, Adrien turned. The look on his face was not triumph nor relief alone. It was recognition completed. As if from the first moment he had seen her with the napkins in the corridor, some argument inside him had been moving toward this answer. They spoke their vows beneath pale light and old wood darkened by generations of weather. Lisara's voice did not shake. Adrien's steadiness deepened on the final words, as if permanence itself required effort he was willing at last to give. Afterward, when the bells had rung and guests drifted toward the house and the autumn sun lay golden on the river fields, they paused for one brief moment alone in the chapel porch. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She considered. "Yes," but no longer of disappearing. His mouth softened, that rare, near smile which always seemed less an ornament than a truth escaping discipline. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." Years later, visitors to Thornwood would speak of its order, its calm, its unusual atmosphere of intelligence in matters usually ruled by display. They would note that the Duchess understood estate figures, tenant petitions, and social subtleties with equal ease. They would say she had a way of making foolish people hear themselves without once raising her voice. They would say the Duke consulted her openly, that his house became warmer after marriage without ever becoming softer in its standards, that certain aspiring mothers thought twice before underestimating plain daughters in her presence. Some stories, told badly, would claim that a powerful man rescued an overlooked woman and placed her where she belonged. Those who knew the truth understood otherwise. Adrien had seen Lisara before she knew how to stand fully in the shape of being seen. He had offered her a door, but Lisara herself had crossed the threshold, spoken in the rooms that wished her silent, faced the mother who would have reduced her to classification, and chosen a life in which usefulness would never again be mistaken for invisibility. On winter evenings, she sometimes stood at the long west window of Thornwood's blue drawing room while candles moved below stairs and wind traveled softly through the cedars toward the river. Adrien would come to stand beside her, not claiming the space from her, only joining it. Once, in such an hour, he said, "What are you thinking of?" She looked at the glass where their reflections stood together, his grave height, her quieter form no longer arranged for erasure. "The old house," she said, "and the girl who thought being necessary was all she was allowed to be." He waited. Lisara rested her hand on the window latch, cool beneath her fingers. "I pity her a little," she said, "but not too much. She did what she knew. And what do you know now?" Beyond the window, the lawn fell away into darkness, and beyond that lay the country, with all its hungry rooms, its daughters prepared for display, its women trained to mistake endurance for destiny. Lisara turned from the glass and met her husband's eyes. "That being seen is not the same as being chosen," she said. "It is something larger. One may be chosen by another and still live half-hidden. But once a woman truly sees herself, the world must negotiate with that fact or break itself against it." Adrien's expression held the same grave wonder it had on the day he first recognized her in the corridor. "And which will it do?" he asked softly. Her answer came with the quiet certainty of a life earned in full view. "Both," she said.